Okay, good morning. Today's daf is Tzadichet. We're going to start in Tzadi Zayin. The last piece, about I would figure that's about 12 or 14 lines from the bottom. 11 lines. Okay, so 11 lines up from the bottom. Pshita. This is where we left off yesterday. Pshita nitkaven lizrok shimone vizarak arba. It's obvious that if a person intended to throw 8 amot and they only threw 4, now how many do you have to throw in the Reshut HaRabim in order to be liable? Only 4, right? So if the person meant to throw 8 but he only threw 4, so Hare Katav Shem Mishimon, this is the same as a person who intended to write the name Shimon, which is of course made up of 5 letters, and only wrote the first 2 letters, which spell Shem, which is also a name. So writing half of what you wanted to write, if it meets the minimum quantity, can be a liability. So too, if you throw the ball, you meant to throw it, let's say you meant to throw it 12 feet and it only went 6 feet, so we'll still say that you did the minimum amount that you needed to be liable, and it moved you towards your goal, so we can't complain. You did it. However, nitkaven lizrok arba vizarak shimone. But what if it's the opposite? It's not that you wanted to throw 8 amot and it came only 4, but you actually wanted to throw 4 amot and you passed your goal and threw 8. So you disappointed yourself because really you only wanted to. You were playing golf and you only wanted it to reach the hole and it went past. So what do? So in that case, what's the status? Mahu. Mi amrinan ha'apikle. Do we say, well, in the end, in the final analysis, he threw more than 4 amot, so we don't really care that he threw more than he wanted to. He threw as far as he wanted to and more. Or do we say that it's precision? Since he wanted it to land in a certain place and it didn't land there, it's like he didn't accomplish. His action was not what we call Masekhet Shabbat Daf. It wasn't a calculated action. It did not achieve the goal that he had set for it, so therefore he's not liable. That's the question. Because in general, we have an issue in Hilchot Shabbat. On one hand, there are objective ways of looking at actions. On the other hand, we care about your particular goal. And if your goal was to do X and you did Y, we're not going to hold you responsible because the outcome wasn't what you intended. Now, in the case here, do we look at transferring objects a certain distance as just a matter of quantity? So it's like, if you only intended to cook 1 egg and you cooked 2 eggs, we're not going to say, well, you only intended 1 egg, so you cooked 2, I guess that means you're okay. We're not going to say that because you surpassed your goal. So maybe we'll say the same thing here. You wanted to only throw 4, you threw 8, so you did even more than you intended. Or do we look at it as a precision issue, that you intended a specific location, a specific destination, and you didn't reach that destination? So therefore, even though quantitatively you did even more than you aspired to, qualitatively you missed the mark. We're not going to say that you reached your goal because you surpassed it. Now you have to run, get the ball, and bring it back to the mark that you intended to hit. Okay, so that's exactly what the Gemara is asking. And we had said yesterday that the only time that if you throw the ball and it passes the mark, we're going to hold you responsible is when you said wherever it falls, it falls. So you knew it was going to fall past 6 feet, which is the minimum amount it has to travel for you to be liable for transferring the object from place to place in a public domain on Shabbat. And you didn't care if it went past that. So since you didn't care, you're liable, because we're not going to say, well, since you didn't care, it's okay. Since you didn't care and you knew you were going to be throwing it the minimum amount that would be a violation of Shabbat, you're held responsible for it. That's exactly what we said yesterday. Okay, and that was what Ravina said to Rav Ashi. Okay, but then the Gemara says, and now here we have 2 totally diametrically opposed readings of this Gemara. Okay? Now, I'm going to first read it the way that Rashi reads it. Odika amrat, and what you said at the beginning. So in other words, first of all, we already resolved the question. If you meant to throw it 4 amot and it went 8 amot, if you specifically wanted it to land at the 4 amah mark and it went past that, we said yesterday that that's not good. It's only going to qualify as liability if you didn't care how far it went. Okay? And moreover, and what you said, that throwing, when you wanted it to go 8 amot, and it only traveled 4, meaning the opposite, in other words, it went less than you wanted, but it met the minimum specification, So midame, you can't compare that to writing the first two letters of a name. Why not? Because hatam kama de lo ketiv shem lo machtiv le Shimon. Because when it comes to the word Shimon, can you write the word Shin Mem Ayin Vav Nun without writing the word the letters Shin Mem? No, it's the first two letters. You're doing part of what you intended to do. But are you going to tell me that in order to throw something 8 amot, you have to first throw it and it lands at 4 amot? No, it's not. It's rather than it be part of the action, it's a truncated action, basically. It's a truncated action. Okay, that's the way Rashi reads it. So according to Rashi's way of learning this, we come out with a leniency. That what it's saying is that if you wanted to throw it 8 amot and you only threw it 4, it's a truncated action and you're not liable. However, the Rambam comes along and says the exact opposite of this. He ends up reading this Gemara and other, he's not the only one, other Rishonim end up reading this Gemara not as a rhetorical question, but actually as fact. In other words, it's saying just like writing the letters Shin Mem from the word Shimon count, so too throwing the ball 4 amot when you meant to get it at 8 amot counts also, because it's halfway to the destination. You're 50% closer than you were before. So actually, the Rambam, the halakha, ends up being not like Rashi here, but that if you throw a ball 4 amot, even though you intended to throw it 8, since you got closer to your destination, just like if you write the first 2 letters of the word, it's going to be a liability for you on Shabbat. So that's the way that many of the other Rishonim interpret this Gemara, not as a rhetorical question, but as a statement. How are they similar? They're similar because in both cases you are getting closer incrementally to your ultimate goal. We don't look at it as a truncated action, we look at it as a partial achievement of your goal, and you're not there yet, but you're there enough that you have violated Shabbat. Okay, so now we come on to a new piece here, and then we're going to get into it. There's a lot of math in today's Gemara. It's not as complex as yesterday, but there's just a couple of numbers you're going to have to keep in mind. Now, Tanu Rabbanan, but not yet. The rabbis taught Hazorek, Rishut Harabim, Rishut Harabim, Rishut HaYachid Be'emtza. This is what we talked about yesterday in the Mishnah of 2 days ago, but it's actually it's the reverse scenario, where you have not 2 houses with a public domain in the middle, but 2 public domains with a house in the middle. So the house sits on one street on one side and another street on the other side. And you are standing on Rockville Pike and you throw through the window and it lands on, what's it called? Wood Glen Drive, okay? So in that case you have a building situated such that one side of the building is one Reshut HaRabim, one public domain. The other side of the building is another public domain. You throw it through the window and it lands in the other public domain. So
it goes from one window to the opposite side.
Right.
Into the other.
Into the other public domain. So what's the halacha? So Dalid Amot Chayav. Pachot mi arba amot patur. So you could actually, it's very funny. You threw it, let's say you were standing a few feet away from the building on one side. So you threw the ball 2 amot, and then it went into the house. And then it came out of the house and traveled another 2 amot into the other Reshut HaRabim. So what are you going to say? Did the ball travel 4 amot in a Reshut HaRabim? It did, right? Just not the same one, right? 2 different public domains, but it traveled a total of 4 amot. So that is exactly what this Braita says. That if it travels 4 amot in the Reshut HaRabim, even though it passed through a private domain in between, it doesn't matter. What might you have thought? You learn 2 important principles from this statement of the rabbis. Number 1, that you can combine the travel of the object in 2 different Reshuyot HaRabim, in 2 different public domains. It traveled half of the distance that was necessary for violating Shabbat in one domain, and half of the distance that was necessary for being considered transferred on Shabbat in another domain. And we don't care about the fact that these are 2 different public domains, because they're both the same category of domain, namely public domain.
Assuming...
And it never stopped in between.
Assuming it's within one action.
It's within one action. It flew through the window.
Right.
So if it stopped in the middle, and the other thing you learn from this is kiluta kimashu hunchad, the principle that we talked about yesterday, that is passing through an airspace considered to be resting in that area? Obviously not. Because if it were considered to be resting in that area, then what would you have here? You would have a situation where when it passed through the private domain in between, it would have been considered to have stopped there. It wouldn't have been considered to have flown through. So even though you might have been liable for transferring from the public into the private, you wouldn't have been liable for transferring from the public. That you wouldn't have been liable for the quantitative, addition of those extra 2 amot on the other side, because it would have been considered to have rested in between.
Can I ask a
Yes.
question? If you threw it and it landed inside the house, that would be from the
Public to private.
and into the private, you would be liable.
Right.
Right? But if it doesn't stop there and goes into there and goes less than 2 amot,
Then you would be patur. Right.
Then you would be patur.
Right.
So the fact that it traveled through also is not counted. Like that was
Exactly.
the
That's
fact
the
that
point.
it did not rest, and the fact
That's
that
exactly what it
it's
means.
Less than,
That's exactly what kluta kemashehuncha was, the idea that if it passes through an area, we look at it as if it rested in that area.
Okay.
So we're saying we don't say that. Dila amrinan, we don't say kluta kemashehuncha, because if we were to say that, then there would have been an interruption in your action midstream. It would have been seen as if it came to rest in that private domain midway, and that would have broken your action into 2 parts. And everybody agrees that if your action is broken into 2 parts, you can't be liable.
Yeah, but you are liable because if it's like Kaluta, it's landing, it's in Rishut Rabin.
Right, you would have been liable for something else, but since your intention in this case was to get it to the other Rishut Rabim, you wouldn't be. Right? So in theory you could have been liable, but since your intention was for it to land in the other Rishut Rabim, you wouldn't be liable if it stopped in the private domain, because you didn't achieve your goal. Okay? So the idea here...
From public to private domain.
But it was not your goal. Your goal was to get to the other side, to get to the other public domain. So if it stopped there, it would interrupt your action. And even if conceptually it stopped there because we considered passing through the private domain to be as if it stopped, that would also be a problem. It would break your action into 2.
It would be different if your goal was to put it inside the house,
Right.
but it actually went.
That would also be not liable because it didn't get to your goal. Right.
Yeah.
Now, so that's the basic principle. So Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. So Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said that Rabbi Abba said that Rav Huna said that Rav said, Ma'avir daled amod b'reshut harabim mikora patur. Lefi she'eno domeh lediglei midbar. That a person who carries 4 amot in a roofed public domain is not liable, because this is not similar to the diglei midbar. This is not similar. What is our prototype? What is our paradigm for a public domain? It is the midbar where the Jews traveled in the wilderness. That's right. Like a shopping mall would be, like a huge shopping mall would be a good example, possibly. But the problem is it has walls. So it would have to be like a huge open, like market or something like that has a roof on top but is open on the side, so there's no walls, right?
An airport, the Rishut Yachid.
No, because it has walls. Anything that has walls, deoraita, is automatically a Rishut Yachid. So you would have to envision kind of like an outdoor fair or something like that just has an overhang of a roof, but it doesn't have walls. So the point is that since it's not like the midbar, it's not like the desert, and our paradigm from which we learn all the halachot of Shabbat is going to be that desert, so therefore it's not going to be counted. Now what the Gemara is going to do here is there's going to be a little bit of mathematics on this Amud and the next one, but it's not too much really. It's really simple, so don't get overwhelmed. So the Gemara asks, Ini, is that really true? V'ha'agalot dimekorot havyan. The agalot, the wagons. Now these wagons are a reference to the wagons that they use to transport the boards of the Mishkan. If you recall, in Parashat Naso, the Nisi'im, the princes, donate a bunch of agalot. They donate some wagons for the carrying of materials as part of their offering, as part of what they wanted to offer to the for the dedication of the Mishkan. And so the Bnei Merari are the ones who are in charge of the boards of the Mishkan, and they had 4 agalot. And there are 48 boards. So that means each agalah, each wagon has to carry 12 boards. Okay? Now these wagons were considered to be mikorot. They were considered to be roofed areas, as we're going to see in a second. Va'amar Rav mishum Rabbi Chia, and Rav said in the name of Rabbi Chia, agalot tachtehen ubenehen v'tzidehen reshut harabim. That Rav had said that in the name of Rabbi Chia, that these agalot, these wagons, were considered to be a reshut harabim. Underneath the wagon was a reshut harabim. Next to the wagon was a reshut harabim, and between the wagons, when they would travel next to each other, was considered, or when they were parked next to each other, was considered reshut harabim. That's what he said. Now the only problem is what? Yeah, they have a little bit of a thing there. Yeah.
From here to here is reshut harabim.
Right. So the problem is as follows: that when they would lay the boards on these wagons, they would jut out 2.5 amot on each side. The reason is because the boards are 10 amot in length. They were laid across the width of the agala. So what would happen is that 2.5 amot would jut out on either side. And so when they were next to each other, what would happen is the space in between the agalot, the 5 amot, would be completely covered by the boards hanging over. Because agala is over here and its boards are hanging over. Agala over here, its boards are hanging over. So that they were next to each other. So the 5 amot in between are actually, there's a roof over them, constructed of the boards that are hanging over. And yet Rav said that is considered to be a reshut harabim. So how could it be? So ki ka'amar Rav bidarata. What Rav was talking about was the space between those boards. Okay, because the boards are stacked. The space between the stacks of boards. Let's say you have 4 stacks of 3 each to make the 12. Okay, now each one of these boards is an amma and a half in its width. Okay, so if you had 3 stacks of 4 boards, you're going to have an amma and a half of width, an amma and a half of width, an amma and a half of width. That's 4.5 amot. The length of the agala is 5 amot, so that's going to leave you a half an amma of space distributed between these 3 stacks. Okay, so a quarter of an amma between stack 1 and stack 2, and a quarter of an amma between stack 2 and stack 3. Let's say if there were 3 stacks of 4 each, let's say. Okay, so depending on how they were laid out, we're going to see.
The inside the wagon.
They're laid on top of a wagon.
Right.
Yeah, and they're hanging over. So the spaces in between the stacks. Oh, do they have a picture there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the spaces in between the stacks are where the reshut harabim would be, according to this.
This is it's hard to see, but this is laying over the side of.
Yeah, that's coming up. We didn't get to that picture
so the
yet.
spaces are, but
We didn't get to that picture yet, so don't be confused by that one.
The reshut harabim is in the wagon.
In between the wagons.
You can see this very, very small space. It's hard to see, but there's.
Yeah, in between the wagons is where the space is.
You see the small spaces? That's what it's described.
Yeah, so in between the wagons, they're next to each other. The space in between them, because on the wagon itself is a private domain.
But the spaces are happening on the wagon, aren't they?
No, it's hanging over.
Yes.
Okay, so if you have something here
right.
and something here hanging over,
Well, so
there's
it's the
a
space
space in between the hanging over. Between the hanging over.
over.
I have a hard time with those diagrams. I can't understand them. Yeah, so I don't know why. It's easier for me to talk and to see it in that. I don't have a hard time visualizing it, translating that picture into reality.
2D.
Anyway, but it doesn't matter. And anyway, Rashi has a little bit of a different interpretation to Tosafot, and a lot of people go with Tosafot, and I'm just sticking with the Rashi because I found it a little bit easier to explain. So some of the pictures might be following another view. So anyway, you have the hangover, and since in between the hanging over boards is space, that's what Rav is talking about. But the only problem is like this. Let's analyze this for a second, because Orchad Agala Kama Havei Chamesh Amin, there are only 5 amot of length in the Agala. So Putyad de Keresh Kama Havai Amatau Palaga. And the width of each one of these amot, as each one of these kerashim, each one of the boards is 1.5 amot, which means you can only have how many stacks? A total of 3.
Right.
That's your maximum, because that's 4.5. Okay, so once you do that, so kama motiv tlata, so you can only have 3 stacks of 4 each. So pashale palgada amata, so you're going to have half an amma, which is distributed between stack 1 and stack 2, let's say, and between stack 2 and stack 3. So ki shadele mar bene u bene kalavud dame. So the only problem is that what is a quarter of an amma in between these stacks? A quarter of an amma is not going to be enough. It's a quarter of an amma. An amma is 6 tefachim. Okay? So a quarter of it is only going to be 1.5 tefachim, and we know that anything less than 3 tefachim is considered closed. So even if you have three, basically envision three stacks of boards hanging over. There's 1.5 tefachim between the first one and 1.5 between the second and the third, but neither of those two spaces is large enough to be considered a Reshut HaRabim. So how can Rav say that there's a Reshut HaRabim there? It's totally closed, halachically. So what does he say? So he answers, no, mi savrat kerashim aputayu hava manachlehu ahudan manachlehu. That's what we're showing in the picture. In other words, don't think that they were laid across. They weren't laid flat. They were laid on their sides, because the actual dimension of these boards was 1.5 amot in this way, and the depth of it was 1 amah. The thickness was 1 amah. So they laid it on the thickness of the board and stacked it that way. So rather than have 1.5 amot, they had 1 amah, and they stacked it on top of the 1 amah. So what could they do then? If you have only 1 amah, what can you end up doing? If you had, let's say, 3 stacks of 1 amah thickness, so then how many amot do you have left? 2. You're going to have 2 amot thickness, okay? So now the Gemara says, Sof sof sumcha dekeresh kama have ameta. Kama hava motiv arba'a. Well, if that's true, then how many stacks would they make? They're going to make the maximum amount of stacks, because they want to have the least number laying on top of each other. So if there were actually 5 amot of space, and they had only 1 amah that they needed to put down, then they're going to make 4 stacks of 3 instead of 3 stacks of 4. And if they make 4 stacks of 3, so then what's going to happen? You're taking up 4 amot, and all you have is an amah. And if you distribute that amah in between stack 1 and stack 2, stack 2, stack 3, stack 3 and stack 4, so you're dividing up the amah into 1/3, right? And what's 1/3 of an amah? Only 2 tefachim. And so you got the same problem, it's less than 3 tefachim. Okay, this isn't too complicated, the math, right? This is okay. So basically what you end up having is lavud again. You end up having sealed. So whatever area is in between these agalot is again totally sealed from a halachic perspective. It's not going to help us that we're resting the boards now on their point, so to speak, on their thickness rather than on their width. So the Gemara says again. So pashala amta. So you have only an amal of kishadila mar beni uveni kalavutame. So again, it's going to be sealed. So hanicha lamanda amar krashi milamatan ovyan ama milamalan kalin veholechin ad kaetzba shapir. So there is one way we can salvage this, because as we're going to see on the next Amud, there is a position that holds that these kerashim that we tend to envision the way that Art Scroll and other chumashim have depicted them as being totally even. But there's an opinion that says that actually they sloped inward. So they came to a point. That's a good picture. It looks like a tree, right? So they came to a point at the end. So that would mean that actually you would have a pretty significant amount of space in between them, because they became so thin. In other words, if they really thinned out at the top and became like an arrow or like a tree, they were shaped like a tree, so then the spaces in between would now be more than 3 tefachim in between each one, and you could say that the spaces in between those boards would be large enough to allow for an area that could be considered Reshut HaRabim, because it would be not roofed.
Why assume that? I mean, it sounds like it comes out of left field.
That they come to a thin point? That's on the next time what he's going to explain it. That's independent of this. There's an opinion that holds that. Okay, but according to the one that say they're solid, the same all the way along, so that's where our problem is emerging, because we were working with that view. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Kahana be'atba'e. Okay, so what is the be'atba'e? So what does Rav Kahana say? Be'atba'e. So Rashi has 2 different versions of this. He brings one from Rabbotav, from his teachers, and one that he explains himself. So the way that his teachers explain atba'e is, it means the rings. The ring is a long Rashi, and on the next page too. It means the rings. In other words, remember that these boards had rings sticking out of them because there was a bar that went in between them, right? There was a ring that jutted out, and there was a bar that went to hold them tight together. Right. So they couldn't, when they would put 2 karashim next to each other, they had to put back facing back. They couldn't put front facing front, because if they did, the rings would bang against each other. So it means that they would face them outward, with the rings facing outward. They would put 2 together, and 2 together like this. Okay? That's how they would stack them.
Right.
Okay.
Rashi says attached with clips.
Right, well that's another thing. Don't worry about clips yet,
Oh,
okay?
okay.
So this is what Rabbotav, this is what his teachers say. So the teachers say that this is how they would do it. Okay? So they would have stacks of they would stack up and the way that it has to be understood is 2 next to each other, 2 next to each other, 2 next to each other, making 6. And then on the other side, 2 next to each other, 2 next to each other, 2 next to each other, making 6 for the 12. Okay? And then in between the two is going to be space of the other, now you have an entire amma of space in between. See, and an entire amma of space is 6 tvachim, so you're going to have an open, wide space there. So Rashi interprets it. It's not so much an argument about about how they were laid out between Rashi and his teachers, as much as it seems like it's an argument about what the word ba'at ba'e means, if it should have an ayin or not. So they had an ayin which comes from the word taba'ot. But Rashi says, why would it mention the taba'ot here? Why would it mention the rings if the main point is that they stacked them 2 stacks of 3 on one side of the agala and 2 stacks of 3 on the other side of the agala, leaving space in between. So therefore Rashi says it means like a clip. So just like a clip has a prong here and a prong here, it has a prong on one side and a prong on one side. They come from the same base, obviously, a clip. But the point is that there are 2 prongs on a clip that have a space in between. So too, these stacks were on one side 2 stacks of 3, and on one side 2 stacks of 3, right next to each other with the space in the middle, like a clip has a space in the middle. That's how Rashi is interpreting it. So he says the word bat be means clip. Okay, so that's just a technical question about what the word means, basically. But the point is that according to this, rather than have them evenly spaced out, 4 stacks, stack 1, stack 2, stack 3, stack 4, it was 2 stacks of 3 on one side, 2 stacks of 3 on the other side, space in between. And if that's true, so then now when they're jutting out over the agalot, even though they're jutting out from both sides, the space in between the jutting out is going to be an entire amma, and that was what Rav meant, that could be considered a Reshut HaRabim. Why? Because it doesn't have a roof over it. Because we just said that if it has a roof over it, it can't be a Reshut HaRabim. So now the Gemara asks, but where is it that these things are resting? On top of the agala. On top of the wagon, and agala gufa mikora havai. The problem is that the agala itself is also roofed. Why? Because you just told me that not only is next to the agala a Reshut HaRabim, not only is next to it a public domain, also under it is a public domain. How could that be? If this is a wagon? How could a wagon be not sealed? Obviously, the wagon has a bottom. So if you're underneath the wagon, the bottom of the wagon is going to be over you. So how could it be? So the Gemara says, Amar, as we turn to Amud Bet Amar Shmuel bi Tedot, that the way that the wagon was constructed was not as we envision it, as having a solid bottom, but it was actually made as like a cart that had 3 pegs that the boards, right, there you go. So that's the way that the agala would look, with 3 pegs. So actually in between the pegs of the agala was also wide open, and therefore one who was under it would not necessarily be under. If you were under there, yeah, it was like a frame. It was like a frame more than a solid piece. So if you envision the boards hanging over the parts that had pegs, okay, so they're not taking away any of that airspace. And so if you were underneath the agala, you're neither underneath the boards, you're in between the space. In other words, you're under the space in between the boards, and also in between the structure, the frame. In other words, you're under the frame of the wagon, because it was only a frame. So you could actually be right underneath the sky, because you're not directly underneath the boards, and you're not directly underneath the pegs that make the frame of the agala, because there's like an open space, like a cart. It's like a cart almost. So now, so that's how it could be that both underneath the wagon and next to the wagon is a Reshut HaRabim, because they're open to the sky. They're not sealed. So now Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Now we go back to this issue that we raised before about the shape of the Karashim. And the rest of this Amud is basically going to deal with the way that the curtains and the boards of the Mishkan were laid out. Not directly relevant to Hilchot Shabbat, but interesting and something that as we get to Parashiot, Truma, and Tzitzaveh very soon, if you keep this in mind, you'll be able to make more sense out of it. Tan Rabbanan, the rabbis had Karashim milamatan ovyan, Amma. That the kirashim at the bottom were an amma wide. But then they would come together like to a point, like an arrow on top, or like a tree almost shape on top, till they came to just the thickness of a finger on the top. Shenemar, as it says, yutamim al rosho, as it says, they would be, we would translate tamim as normally as complete on top. But tamim, here he's saying they end on top, meaning that they come to an end. They come to a point, is how he's interpreting it. Ulahalanu omer, tamu nikhratu. Like the Pasuk says, they ended, they were cut off. In other words, he's interpreting the word tamim al rosho, finishing on top, as meaning being cut off on top, because they come to a point. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Nechemia says, Kishem shemilimatan ovyan amma, kach milbalan ovyan amma. Just like at the bottom they're an amma wide, so too on top they're an amma wide. Shenemar yachdav, because it says they were together. In other words, they were absolutely even together, and there was no separation between them. And if they came to a point like that, there would be separation between them. They wouldn't be totally evenly lined up with each other. Va'ketiv tamim. What about the word tamim? What does he do with the word tamim? Obviously, he doesn't think that the word tamim means that they taper off on top. So what does he interpret tamim as meaning? How deletu shelemin velaletu denisra. What that means is you can't use the cheap wood that you get at when you buy a table at home, at IKEA or something like that, the pressed wood that's made from different pieces. You had to use naturally complete pieces of wood that they would cut, not wood that was combined from other sources and pushed together. That's why it says tamim. Tamim meaning perfect.
Wood is straighter.
Well,
the wood like that is straight.
Maybe, yeah, because it's artificial.
Because you can
meld it, you can put it in. Yeah, it's true. Ve'idach nami. But what about Rabbi Yehuda haketiv yachdav? What about the word that says yachdav, which means that they have to be together, and you're saying that they taper off on top? Ha'udela lishalchufinu mehadadeh. So he says that what that means is that you shouldn't bend them away from each other. In other words, they have to stand. They have to be positioned evenly. Mechuvanim, Rashi says. It says that they have to be right next to each other in a line. One shouldn't be a little bit further in, one a little bit further out, one bending this way, one bending that way, but they should be straight up and straight in a line. So even though the tops obviously are not going to touch one another because they're tapering inward, and the bottoms are against one another, so if they're tapering inward, it's going to look kind of like almost like our little symbol of Magen David, tapering in. So if you had many of those lined up next to each other, the tops wouldn't touch each other because there's going to be space between the tops, but they would be lined up on the bottoms, and that's what it means to be yachdav, to be together.
Yeah, good carpenters to do this.
Yeah, they had to be. Yeah. So well, that's what it says, that they were really good. Bishlama.
Planers.
Right.
Yeah. Bishlama lemanda amar kashem shelem milematan ovyan amakach milemalan ovyan ama hainu tichtivu liyarkatei mishkan yama taseh shisha kerashim ushnei kerashim taseh lemekutzot. So it makes sense according to the one that says that these boards were totally even. And they were totally even from top to bottom, what the Torah says, because what the Torah tells us is that you're going to have a little bit of a problem when you get to the corners of the Mishkan, because you have boards coming, let's say, from one direction and from the other direction. So let's say on the western side of the Mishkan you had 6. It was longer than it was wide, right? So it was 30 amot in length, the Mishkan, and it was 10 amot in width. Now if you have 6 kerashim, each of which is 1.5 amot in width, which is what the Torah says. So that's not going to be quite 10 amot. That's only going to be 9, first of all. And when they come to meet the other side, the other boards, so the other boards are either going to, if you want to seal them, there's going to be overlap. Because let's say you have 2 boards coming. So this last board coming from this direction, let's say the board that's on the southern side, okay, or the northern side rather. Because remember, the front of the Mishkan, the Kodesh HaKodeshim is in the west, not the east. It's the opposite of our synagogues. So here's the west side, here's the north side. Okay, so where they're touching, if they're going to touch them, there's going to have to be overlap between the 2 boards. So that's going to cut off the end of this wall, the end of the northern wall. So what happened? They made corner pieces. The corner piece would be 1.5 amot also. So it would cover the half. It would cover this side of the boards, and it would also, in other words, it would be. They have a picture, yeah. So what? So this corner piece is what they're talking about. So it would line up flush with the 6 karashim over here, but its side would be flush with the karashim coming from the other direction. So basically, it gave you an extra half amma on either side. They had it on both sides. So you would get an extra half amma on one side of the 9 amot on the west side, and an extra half amma on the other side, for a total of 1 full amma that you needed to make the 10. And the other amma, because remember they were 1.5 amot thick, the other amma of that piece is covered by the thickness of the amma of the boards coming from the other direction. Because remember, the board that's coming this way, what we're going to see is the thickness of it, which is 1 amma, not the width of it, which is 1.5 amot. We're going to see the thickness. So that thickness is going to cover 1 amma of the board. The other half amma of the board is going to be exposed and next to these 6 amot, and the same on this side. And the same on this side.
Right.
Okay, so half of it will be exposed, and 1 amma of it will be covered by the one coming from the other direction. So therefore, you don't have a problem of overlap. It seals off the one that's coming from the northern side, and the ones that's coming from the southern side are sealed off with the 1 amma of this board. Half of an amma of either board is exposed, giving you a total of 10 amot for the west side, and covering the open end of the northern wall and the southern wall without diminishing the dimensions. Okay, so that makes sense if they're all square. But wait a second, if they're not square, how's this corner piece going to work? It's not going to work so well. So what are you going to do with a corner piece if it's not square? So the Gemara asks, Ela lemanda amar milematan ovyan amar milemalan kalin volachin ad ke'etzba. Hi, I'm sorry, I skipped this part, right? So, dahate putya dahane mimalele lesumcha dahane. Because if you have everything being square, everything being evenly made and not tapering, so then you have no problem. Because the corner pieces will fill the thickness of the other piece, and everything is going to work out perfectly, and it fits together exactly as it should. However, if you're going to say that they taper off, that they come and they taper, so so how is it going to work? If you look at the shape of these in the corner, you're going to have a bizarre shape. You can't really fit like one piece in there, because it's actually going to be even wider of an opening, because they're each going to be tapering. So when the northern walls is facing the western wall, let's say, for example, the end of the northern wall and the end of the western wall, they're each tapering in. So how are you going to fit a corner piece that's going to manage to unite them? Right. So the answer is, what do you do? Dishafelo kituran, kiturin. You're going to have to make it like a mountain. In other words, that corner piece, rather than tapering off the way that they do, is going to have to be the reverse. It's going to have to be wide on top and taper down in order to fill, like it says, like a mountain. It's going to have to fill that space properly. So you're going to have a way of you're going to have to construct a corner piece that will fill the space and then somehow blend in on the bottom. So it's going to be a different shape. Right, it's customized. Right, do they have a picture here? Yeah, so you can see, they're going to have a fitted piece that will bridge the gap properly, because you see that you're going to have a piece that's thicker on top that's going to be able to fit in to the space and make it complete.
Calculate the angle.
Yeah, so you're going to have to work the angle out. Exactly. It said that there was one piece that would hold all the kirashim together and went through the center of them. Tanab B'nei Haya Omed, that it was a miracle. Why? Because it was one bariach that curved around the entire Mishkan. Then the Gemara goes on to say, so now we're going to have to deal with a different implication of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah's machloket, which is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, that these boards tapered off, they also thinned out to a nothing, basically, on the top, to a minuscule amount. Whereas according to Rabbi Nehemiah, they were the thickness of an amma all the way to the top. So that's going to mean, actually, that when you drape the curtains over these boards, so according to Rabbi Nechemia, whenever you drape something over the boards, you're going to lose an amah because there's a thickness of an amah on top. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that at the top these boards were razor thin, let's say. So you're really not going to lose anything when you drape the curtain over. Nothing is necessary for the top of the board because the top of the board is razor thin because it's tapered in thinness also. Okay, it's totally narrow. So the Gemara is going to have to deal with these implications here, as we're going to see. So it says that you have to make. Now there were 3 layers of curtains laid atop the roof of the Mishkan. So we're just going to talk about the first 2 today. So the first is the 10 curtains, Orech Hayira Achat Shemona Ve'esrim Ba'ama, and it was 28 amot in total. Okay, so you have a 28 amma length of curtain. Okay, so Shadei Orchayu Leputiyat de Mishkan. So what did they do? The length of 28 amot is laid across the width of the Mishkan. The width of the Mishkan, so how's that going to work? So Kama Havya Esrin Utmane. So what do? So the width we said was 10 amot, right? So 28 minus 10 equals 18. So in other words, you drape the 28, there's a length of 28 curtains. You drape them over the Mishkan so it covers the 10 amot in the middle. In other words, the 10 amot width of the Mishkan, and you have 9 hanging on one side and 9 hanging on the other side because 18 divided by 2 is 9. So what are you going to do now? So Pashulahu tet lahai gisa v'tet lahai gisa. There are 9 on either side. The Rabbi Yehuda Megalia Amad Adanim. But the only thing is that remember the kirashim, the boards were a total of 10 amotai. So if there's only 9 amot hanging on one side, 9 amot hanging on the other side, you're going to be short 1 amah. And what is that amah? That's actually the adanim, because these the boards were inserted in bases. But they were the bottom of the boards were pronged, so they fit perfectly into the bases. So you didn't lose any space actually. In other words, it doesn't increase the length of the boards at all because the kerashim were 10 amot, and the aden fits the last piece. It doesn't take away from it. It fits the last amah. Okay, so it's inserted in there. So if you have only 9 amot hanging over, so what's going to happen? That last amah, which is the insert, the bolt on the bottom, is going to show. According to Rabbi Yehuda, but according to Rabbi Nechemia, it's going to be even worse because the Rabbi Nechemia Begalia Amad Krashim. But according to Rabbi Nechemia, you're going to have 2 amot showing. Why? Because he loses an amah for the top of the boards. So you covered the width of the Mishkan itself, of the airspace of the Mishkan with 10. Then you're going to lose another amah with the top of the boards on either side. So you're actually only going to have 8 amot hanging down, not 9. Okay, so now we say Shadei Putayu Le'orkad de Mishkan, and of course, since we've draped the length of these curtains, which was 28 amot, across the width of the Mishkan, that means that the width of these curtains is going to go across the length of the Mishkan, obviously. Correct? Must be. So how does that work? Kama Havyan Arba'in, and that was 40. It was 10 curtains. And the 10 curtains were 4 amot in their width. So that means that there's 40 amot. And there's 30 amot in length. So you're going to have 10 left, right? So you're going to have 10 left since it's going to, after the draping is done and it's covered the 30. So 40 minus 30 is 10. So what happens now? So then dal tlatin leigra. So you minus 30 pashat lehud yud. So you have 10 left over. LeRabbi Yehuda mechasya amad adanim. LeRabbi Nechemia megalia amad adanim. Now that totally hung over the back of the Mishkan because the front of the Mishkan is open. Right? It had another one. Right. So this one only hangs over the back. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, how much do you have to hang over? The entire 10, which means you're going to have it totally covered all the way down to the bottom. According to Rabbi Nechemia, you're going to have only 9 because you're going to need 1 just to get over the top of the board. It's an extra amah. So you're going to have still the bolt showing. So what Rabbi Yehuda has on the sides, just the bolt showing. Rabbi Nechemia has in the back, just the bolt showing. Ve'asita yiriot izim la'oel. So the next level was the curtains of goat hair. Orech hayira achat shloshim bama, and the length was 30 amot. Shadi orchayu leputya de mishkan kama havya. So you would lay the length of these of the second layer across the width of the mishkan again. So how much is that? Tzlatin. These were 30 amot instead of 28. So we know that the width of the Mishkan is only 10. So dal eser le'igra, so you minus 10 from that, and what do you have left? Pashalahu eser lahayigisa ve'eser lahayigisa. So you're going to have 10 hanging over on either side. Right? 30 minus 10 is 20. 20 divided by 2 is 10. So what happens? So the Rabbi Yehuda mechasya amad adanim. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, what's going to happen? You're going to have an entire full 10 amot. So before he had only 9, right? So he still had the bottom pieces open. Now they're going to be covered. However, the Rabbi Nechemia megalia amad adanim. But according to Rabbi Nechemia, you're still going to have that bottom piece open. No, you're still going to have the bottom piece open because you're going to lose. In other words, because according to Rabbi Nechemia, you lose another one. So you had 10 into you covered the space in between with 10. So you have 10 on either side. According to Rabbi Nechemia, though, you're only going to have 9 on either side because you're going to have to account for the 1 amma of top. So that's going to be only 9 and 9 on either side, which is not going to cover the bottom amma.
None of them knew for sure whether it had fringes or not.
They don't know.
They don't know whether it had fringes or not.
Right, they don't know.
Okay.
So in other words, once you eliminate that amma of the top of the boards, if like Rabbi Yehuda eliminates that, so he has a full 10 amot hanging down. Rabbi Nechemia has that, so he has only 9 amot hanging down. He has to minus another 1 from either side. So he's still going to have the adanim on the bottom showing. So,
but he's got them covered with the other curtain.
no, because that one was too short. That one was too short. Remember, this one is only 1 short. So according to him, there's still going to be 1. Tanya namihachi. We also learned this way. Because we said later that the curtain that hangs over the final curtain that hangs over, right, has an extra amma hanging, right? So it said that, and this is what we're talking about here, right? This layer has an extra amma over the previous layer on either side. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, what does that mean, right? So lechasot amashel adanim divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia Omer lechasot amashel karashim. In other words, this second layer, what did it accomplish with its extra amma? According to Rabbi Nechemia, it accomplished that now the entire board is covered, but still the bolt is exposed. According to Rabbi Yehuda, before the entire board was already covered, so it's now going to cover the metal part on the bottom as well. Shadei putayola orkei the Mishkan. Now we didn't try now with the second layer, we only dealt with it going across the Mishkan. What about the length of the Mishkan? So kama havya mem v'arba. It's 44. So just like it was 30 across instead of 28, it's 44 instead of 40. Going the length of the Mishkan. The length of the Mishkan was 30, right? So how does this work? So first of all, Dal Tlatin Le'igra, we know that it has to cover the 30 amot of the inside of the Mishkan. Pashalahu Arba Sirei, that leaves you with 14, because 44 minus 30 is 14. So Dal Tarte Lechafla Dichtiv Vechafalta Tayra Shishit El Mul Panei Oel, we know that 2 amot of it hung down over the front of the Mishkan. 2 of the amot hung down. And the rest of it was in the back. So in the front, which is the east side where the opening is, there are only 2 amot hanging over. So we have left, Pashalahu, Tarte Sere, we have 12 left. So Bishlam al Rabbi Yehuda. Now how many is going to hang over? Now remember, the Karashim in the back are 10 amotai. Now we have 12 amot hanging. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, what are you going to have? A full 12 amot, because he's going to say that there's no thickness on top. So that means that there's going to be 2 on the ground, because they're going to hang over a 10. The boards are a height of 10. You have 12 hanging over the back, so they're going to be 2 on the ground. According to Rabbi Nechemia, you have a height of 10, but also a thickness of 1. So how many is going to hang on the ground? 1. So that's exactly what it's going to say.
That counts with the 2 hanging in the front.
Right, with the 2 hanging in the front, because you had 14 in total on this one. You have 14 in total on this one, instead of because we increased it. So bishlama Rabbi Yehuda hainu dichtiv chatzi hayira ha'odefet tisrach el Rabbi Nechemia mai tisrach mechavroteha. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it makes sense because it says that half of one of the curtains will lay on the ground, will trail behind the Mishkan, and that's true because each one of the curtains was 4 amot in thickness. Okay, so if 2 are hanging on the ground, that means that these 2 are half of a curtain, and that's exactly what he said. So what does Rabbi Nechemia do with that? He says, no, that means tisrach mechavroteha, that this curtain extends 2 amot past the previous curtain. Not that two are actually on the ground. Actually, only one is on the ground. But it is 2 amot past what the previous curtain reached, because the previous curtain couldn't even cover the bolt on the bottom. It was short one. This one covers that one and another one. So it is half a curtain past the previous curtain. It's just that it's not half a curtain on the ground. And then we say that Tanad Devei Rabbi Yishmael's yeshiva taught, Lama Mishkan Domeh. What is the Mishkan compared to? Le'isha sheme'alechet bashuk v'shipulea me'alechin achareha. The Mishkan is like a woman whose dress trails behind her. In other words, the trailing of the curtain in the back of the Mishkan is like a woman who is trailing her dress, has the train of her dress, dragging behind her, and that's how it's designed. Yeah, so that's a way to finish, and that's where we're going to close for today. Tomorrow there'll be a little bit more about the Mishkan, and then we will get, God willing, to the next Mishnah.